Sienna pulled her coat tighter around her as she stepped onto the quiet sidewalk, the chill of the late evening air biting at her skin. The city had an eerie calm at this hour, the distant hum of traffic the only sound accompanying her footsteps. She had insisted on walking home alone, refusing the limousine her assistant had arranged as usual, but now, a flicker of uncertainty crept in. "Are you sure you should be out here this late?" a deep voice asked behind her. Startled, she turned to see a tall man standing a few feet away. He had strong features, tousled dark hair, and a presence that immediately commanded attention. He wasn't threatening, though his tone was more concerned than anything else. She hesitated, caught off guard. Most people didn't speak to her like this. They recognized her, fawned over her, or avoided her out of intimidation. But this man, he had no idea who she was. "You shouldn't be walking alone," he continued. "This neighborhood isn't the safest at night." Her brows lifted slightly. She had bought an entire luxury penthouse just blocks from here. It was hardly dangerous. But something about his protectiveness sent warmth through her. "I can take care of myself," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. He studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "I'll walk you home," she blinked. "You don't even know where I live." "I don't need to," he said, a small, confident smile playing on his lips. "Just point the way." Sienna hesitated again. She didn't usually accept help from strangers, but there was something steady about him, something safe. So, against her usual instincts, she nodded. They walked in silence for a few moments before she glanced at him. "You always walk strangers home," he chuckled. "Not usually. But I have a daughter, and if she were out this late, I'd want someone to make sure she got home safe." She tilted her head, intrigued. "You're a father?" "Yeah, Charlotte." "She's 6. His voice softened when he mentioned her, and Sienna found herself unexpectedly charmed. "Must be a lot to handle," she said. He exhaled a quiet laugh. "It is. But she's my whole world." Something about the way he said it made Sienna's chest tighten. She had spent years surrounded by men who only cared about power, wealth, and appearances. But this man, whoever he was, seemed entirely unaffected by any of those things. They reached her building, and she stopped, turning to face him. "This is me." He looked up at the towering structure, then back at her with a raised brow. "Fancy place," she smiled. "Something like that." He nodded, then extended his hand. "I'm Adrian." For a second, she hesitated. If she told him her full name, he'd know exactly who she was. Instead, she just said, "Sienna." His hand was warm when she shook it, his grip firm but not overwhelming. "Well, Sienna," he said, "get inside safe." She nodded, lingering for a moment before stepping toward the entrance, but before she disappeared inside, she turned back. "Thank you for walking me home, Adrian." He gave her a casual shrug. "Anytime." And with that, he walked away, completely unaware he had just escorted one of the richest women in the country home. And even more unaware that, in a matter of weeks, she would fall for him hard. Sienna had intended to forget about the man who had walked her home. It was a chance encounter, nothing more. But as she sat in a boardroom the next morning, surrounded by executives vying for her attention, her mind drifted back to Adrian. The quiet confidence in his voice, the way he spoke about his daughter with such devotion, it was unlike anything she was used to. "Miss Laurent," a voice pulled her back to the present. She blinked and turned toward her CFO, who was watching her expectantly. "Yes." "We were discussing the expansion into the European market," he said carefully, as if trying to gauge whether she had been listening at all. "Right. Business." The thing that had consumed her life for the past decade. She straightened, pushing thoughts of Adrian aside. "Proceed with the projections," she said. The meeting continued, but a nagging thought lingered in her mind. She had built an empire from the ground up, outmaneuvering competitors with ruthless efficiency. Yet, a simple walk home with a stranger had stayed with her far longer than it should have. That evening, as she left her office, her driver was already waiting. But instead of getting into the car, she hesitated. On impulse, She turned in the direction she had walked the night before. She told herself she was just clearing her head. But when she reached a small cafe on the corner, she stopped. Through the window, she saw Adrian sitting at a table with a little girl, his daughter, Charlotte. Sienna wasn't prone to curiosity, but something about the scene held her in place. Adrian was laughing at something Charlotte had said, his expression completely unguarded. His daughter, a bundle of energy with dark curls, grinned up at him before reaching across the table for a cookie. Sienna wasn't sure how long she stood there watching them. Long enough to realize that Adrian wasn't just a good father, he was the kind of man who put his child before everything else. And then, as if sensing her, he looked up. Their eyes met through the glass, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, recognition flashed in his gaze, followed by surprise. She had no reason to be here, no logical explanation for why she had stopped. Before she could decide whether to enter or walk away, Charlotte turned her head, following her father's gaze. Then, with all the enthusiasm of a child with no reservations, she waved. Sienna hesitated, but then, against all reason, she pushed open the cafe door. Adrian watched her approach, his brows lifting slightly. "Sienna." "Hi," she said, feeling uncharacteristically unsure of herself. Charlotte beamed up at her. "Do you know my daddy?" Sienna glanced at Adrian, who looked equally amused and cautious. "We met last night," she said. Charlotte tilted her head. "Are you his friend?" Adrian cleared his throat. "We're acquaintances." Sienna surprised herself by smiling. "I'd like to be his friend." Charlotte clapped her hands as if this were the best news she had heard all day. "Then you should sit with us." Adrian let out a quiet laugh. "Charlotte." "I don't mind," Sienna interrupted, surprising even herself. Adrian studied her for a moment before gesturing to the seat across from him. "All right," he said, "but just so you know, we were in the middle of a very important cookie discussion." Sienna settled into the chair, something unfamiliar fluttering in her chest. She had spent years keeping people at a distance, maintaining an impenetrable wall between herself and the world. But here, in a small cafe with a single father and his daughter, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, something dangerously close to warmth. Sienna wasn't entirely sure how it had happened, but one evening at the cafe turned into 3, then 5, then more. It had started innocently enough she found herself drawn to the easy warmth of Adrian and Charlotte's company. The rigid structure of her days, packed with board meetings and high-stakes negotiations, made the little moments in the cafe feel like stolen time. Time where she could just be Sienna, not Sienna Laurent, the billionaire business mogul. Adrian never pressed her about her life, and she found herself grateful for it. It was clear he had no idea who she was, and for the first time in years, she didn't have to explain herself, defend her wealth, or navigate ulterior motives. With him, she was just the woman who had happened to cross his path one fateful night. That evening, as she walked toward the familiar cafe, she saw Adrian standing outside, scanning the street. When he spotted her, relief flickered across his face before he stepped forward. "I was starting to think you wouldn't show," he said. She tilted her head. "You were waiting for me." He hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. "Charlotte's been asking about you all day." A warmth she didn't quite understand settled in her chest. "I wouldn't want to disappoint her then." They walked inside together, and Charlotte's face lit up as she spotted Sienna. She launched herself forward, wrapping her small arms around Sienna's waist. "You're late," Charlotte announced. Sienna let out a quiet laugh. "I didn't realize we had a schedule." Charlotte nodded seriously. "Daddy and I always get cookies at the same time." "And now you're part of the cookie club." Adrian gave her a look that was both amused and apologetic. "Apparently, that's a real thing." Sienna settled into her usual seat, watching as Charlotte animatedly explained the importance of cookie selection. Adrian leaned back against his chair, his expression soft as he listened to his daughter's rambling. At some point, Charlotte got distracted by a coloring book one of the cafe employees had given her. leaving Sienna and Adrian in a rare moment of quiet. "You don't have to keep showing up, you know," Adrian said suddenly, his voice lower than before. Sienna studied him. "Do you want me to stop?" he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "No. But I know you have a life outside of this. You don't owe us your time." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe I like spending time with you." Something flickered in his gaze. "With Charlotte, you mean? With both of you?" Adrian held her gaze for a long moment before looking away. "You're full of surprises, Sienna." She wanted to tell him that he had no idea. But before she could say anything else, Charlotte interrupted, holding up her drawing. "Look. I made a picture of us." Sienna leaned in to look, her heart unexpectedly tight at the sight of the three stick figures, Charlotte in the middle, holding hands with Adrian and Sienna. Adrian glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. And for the first time in years, Sienna felt something shift inside her, something that had nothing to do with business or power. Something far, far more dangerous. Sienna didn't know when it had happened, but Adrian and Charlotte had become a part of her world in a way she never could have predicted. Days that had once been filled solely with board meetings and high-stress negotiations now had stolen moments at the cafe, laughter over cookies, and the warmth of a little girl's hand in hers. But the more time she spent with them, the more the weight of her secret pressed down on her. She had always been careful with who she let into her life, wary of the way people changed when they found out who she really was. And Adrian had no idea. Tonight, though, something was different. As they sat at their usual table, Charlotte curled up next to her with a book. Adrian watched her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. After Charlotte had fallen asleep against Sienna's side, Adrian gestured toward the door. She gently shifted Charlotte so she was resting on the cushioned bench before following him outside. The night air was crisp, the city humming softly around them. "I need to ask you something," Adrian said, his voice quieter than usual. She braced herself. "All right." He hesitated, then exhaled. "Who are you, really?" Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" His gaze didn't waver. "Sienna, I know there's more to you than what you've told me. You show up in designer coats, you always pay in cash, and you never talk about your life outside of this cafe. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't anymore." She swallowed hard. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. "I wanted to tell you," she admitted. "I just didn't know how." Adrian crossed his arms, waiting. She took a steadying breath. "I own Laurent Enterprises." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then the Laurent Enterprises. He sounded almost disbelieving. She nodded. "Yes." Adrian let out a low breath, running a hand through his hair. "You're a billionaire." "Yes." He shook his head slightly, as if trying to process the information. "I don't know what to say." Her chest tightened. "This is why I didn't tell you. People look at me differently when they find out." He studied her for a long moment. "You thought I would," she exhaled. "I didn't want to risk it." Adrian's jaw tensed, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Sienna, I don't care how much money you have. I care about the woman who reads stories with my daughter, who laughs with us, who," he paused, his expression softening, "who makes me feel something I haven't in a long time." Her heart clenched. "Adrian, I just wish you had trusted me enough to tell me sooner," he said, not unkindly. She hated that she had hurt him, even unintentionally. "I was scared." His expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Of what?" She hesitated. Then, quietly, "Of losing this." "Of losing you." Adrian's gaze held hers for a long moment before he stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not going to lose me, Sienna." Her breath hitched. There was something so sure in the way he said it, like it wasn't even a question. And then, before she could think, before she could stop herself, she reached up, her fingers brushing against his jaw. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and then he kissed her. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't unsure. It was everything she hadn't realized she had been waiting for. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I don't care about your money," he murmured. I care about you. Sienna closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words settle into the deepest parts of her. She had built an empire on power and control. But with Adrian, she didn't need either. She just needed him. Sienna had spent her entire life making decisions with unwavering certainty. Expanding her company, securing high-stakes deals, shaping an empire, those were choices she made with ease. But standing here in the quiet of the night, her fingers still tangled in Adrian's shirt, she realized something terrifying. She had no idea what came next. He had kissed her. Not because of her wealth or what she could offer him, but because of who she was when she was with him. And yet the fear still lingered, the fear that this was too fragile, too improbable, too good to last. Adrian's gaze searched hers, his hands steady at her waist as if grounding her. She could see the weight of the revelation still settling in his mind. He hadn't pulled away, hadn't treated her differently, but something had changed. Before either of them could say anything more, a soft noise from inside the cafe caught their attention. Charlotte stirred slightly on the cushioned bench, her little face scrunching in her sleep. Adrian sighed, his arms loosening around Sienna as he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "We should get her home," he said, his voice quieter now. Sienna nodded, though her heart ached at the sudden shift. Together, they walked back inside. Adrian carefully lifted Charlotte into his arms, her head resting on his shoulder as she mumbled something incoherent. Sienna reached out without thinking, brushing a stray curl from Charlotte's face. "She trusts you," Adrian murmured. Sienna looked up at him, startled by the emotion in his voice. "I trust you," he added, softer this time. Something inside her cracked at those words. She had spent so much of her life surrounded by people who wanted something from her board members, investors, social climbers. Trust had always been a transaction. But with Adrian, it was a gift freely given. They walked in silence to his apartment, a modest but warm building a few blocks away. When they reached his door, Sienna hesitated. "You should come in," he said, as if sensing her uncertainty. She followed him inside, taking in the cozy space. It was nothing like the opulent penthouses and luxury suites she was used to, but it felt more like a home than any place she had ever known. Adrian carried Charlotte to her room, tucking her in with practiced ease. Sienna remained by the doorway, watching as he smoothed the blanket over her tiny frame. When he turned back to her, something unspoken passed between them. "Do you want to sit?" he asked, gesturing toward the couch. She nodded, following him into the living room. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with things unsaid. Finally, Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I meant what I said earlier, about not caring about your money." Sienna swallowed. "I believe you, but I need to understand what this means," he continued. "For us," she exhaled slowly. "I don't know, I've never done this before." He gave her a curious look. "Done what?" She hesitated. "Let someone in, really in." Adrian studied her for a long moment, then reached for her hand. His touch was warm, steady. "You don't have to figure it out alone," he said. The simplicity of his words made her chest tighten. She had spent so long making decisions alone, carrying the weight of her world without anyone to share it with. But here he was, offering something she had never dared to hope for. A partnership. A life beyond the walls she had built. She squeezed his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose this." Adrian's expression softened. "Then don't." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it didn't need to be. Because for the first time in her life, Sienna wasn't standing alone. Sienna had expected adjustments. She had expected complications. What she hadn't expected was how effortlessly Adrian and Charlotte had woven themselves into the fabric of her life. Days that used to be defined by back-to-back meetings and rigid schedules now held stolen moments of warmth, early morning coffee with Adrian before their days began. Quiet evenings spent reading with Charlotte, laughter filling spaces that had once felt empty. But there was still a gap between their worlds, one that neither of them could ignore. Sienna sat in her office, staring at the invitation in her hands. A gala. One of the most exclusive events of the year, filled with CEOs, investors, and socialites who thrived in the world she had built. It was expected that she attend. More than that, it was expected that she arrive with someone. Her assistant had already assumed she'd bring a business partner, maybe a potential investor she needed to impress. But the only person she wanted by her side was Adrian. The thought alone made her chest tighten. Would he even want to go? He had never cared about things like wealth or status. She had never seen him in a tuxedo, had never heard him mention anything about high society events. And yet, the idea of walking into that room without him felt wrong. That evening, as she stepped into Adrian's apartment, she found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, stirring something on the stove while Charlotte sat at the counter drawing. Charlotte spotted her first and grinned. Before Sienna could even set her bag down, Charlotte was tugging her toward the kitchen, proudly showing off her latest masterpiece. Adrian glanced up, his eyes lighting up the way they always did when he saw her. Something settled in her chest. This was what she wanted. As Adrian set down the spoon and leaned against the counter, Sienna took a breath. "There's something I want to ask you," she said carefully. He arched a brow, waiting. She hesitated for only a moment before continuing. "There's a gala this weekend. It's a big event and," she exhaled slowly, "I want you to come with me." Adrian's expression didn't shift immediately. He considered her words, his gaze steady. "I don't think I own a suit that would fit in at something like that," he admitted. A small smile tugged at her lips. "That's easy to fix." He shook his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Sienna, are you sure you want to bring me into that part of your life?" She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against his. "I don't want to separate my life into parts anymore." Something flickered in his eyes, something deep, something that made her heart race. Charlotte, oblivious to the moment between them, kicked her feet against the stool. "Is there dancing at this party?" Sienna glanced down at her. "Yes, there's dancing," Charlotte gasped dramatically. "Then Daddy has to go, he loves dancing." Adrian let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I wouldn't say love." Charlotte crossed her arms, looking as serious as a 6-year-old could. "You dance with me all the time." Sienna bit back a laugh, watching as Adrian realized he had no way out of this argument. Finally, he sighed, looking at Sienna. "You really want me there?" She gave his hand a small squeeze. "More than anything." A beat of silence. Then, finally, he nodded. She didn't know why relief flooded through her, but it did. That night, as they curled up on the couch, Charlotte fast asleep in the other room, Adrian pulled her closer. "I don't know much about your world," he admitted. "But if being with you means stepping into it, I'll figure it out." Sienna rested her head against his shoulder, her heart full in a way it had never been before. "You don't have to change," she whispered. "I love you exactly as you are." His arms tightened around her, his lips brushing against her forehead. "I love you too, Sienna." And just like that, the last of the walls she had built around herself crumbled. She had spent years thinking love was a distraction, something that didn't fit into her carefully constructed life. But Adrian had proven her wrong. Love wasn't a weakness. It was the strongest thing she had ever known.